greetings everybody, and it's so frustrating not to be with you. And one of my first intentions is to come to Nottingham and meet many of you. Well, just a point about the Lucas plan. So, I mean, the book, it's here, and it's been published in Nottingham, actually, by Spokesman Books, to whom I'm hugely grateful, because actually, as Alan and also the publicity stressed, this isn't an exercise in nostalgia. If some future, my grandniece was to say to me, Hilary, what did you do during the lockdown? I'd say, well, actually, I spent most of my time on Zooms about Lucas Aerospace, because it's become so, everybody asks about it, talks about it, and what they're not saying we want to imitate it, but I want to just very briefly say one or two differences, but also stress the similarities with now as my intro to the film. And the film is really good and will give you a feeling for how it was done. And then Brian and John, who are on the front line and are still in their own ways on the front line, will tell you in more detail and also draw out the future. So clearly the 70s was very different in the sense that it was pre-Thatcher, and so the unions were still strong. You know, the Shop Stewards organisation in all the engineering industry was very strong indeed, and very confident. And you had a Labour government, and although it ended up a pretty conservative government and prepared the way for monetarism and Thatcher, you know, in accepting the IMF cuts and so on. But at a certain point, Tony Benn was Minister for Industry, and he had a unique commitment, not just to left-wing policies and state intervention, but most importantly, to working with the shop stewards. And he didn't just sort of patronise them, but he really recognised their capacity. I think it was actually his experience of going to the Upper Clyde shipyards when they were being closed, and realising that actually, you know, the commitment to industry was amongst the workers, the shop stewards, not amongst all the companies that his department was funding. And he was particularly impressed by the Lucas stewards. He said, and this is a quote, "Here was a group of workers who'd done the work to anticipate the problem. Others had come to me at the last minute saying their firm had gone bust. What could I do?" The Lucas workers anticipated the problem because they were a very sort of advanced thinking combine. They were a combine that was a shop stewards group that thought as well as acted in a very strategic manner. So just to quickly go through the differences and the similarities. So the differences are the shop stewards movement was strong then. It was a a Labour government, and there were allies in that. And also the other similarity is that the question of the purpose of production was, I mean, this in a way is a similarity and a difference, was under question. So then it was military. I mean, Lucas Aerospace was involved in military production. And at that time, there was a huge peace movement of which many of the shop stewards were part, CND and so on, campaigning against cruise missiles. And so there was a questioning of the purpose of production. So that's, even though the purpose then was military, and now you've got aerospace in general, and high carbon production, and there is now a questioning. There's been a questioning for some time that's now reaching heights because of the danger to do with climate change, a questioning of any high carbon production, and the desire, you know, inspired by younger people, but by the generation that's going to inherit the crisis, you know, a desperation almost to see a transition, a conversion, a green conversion to a low carbon economy. I mean, the other similarity is that just as then there was an economic crisis, particularly a financial driven crisis, so now there's a finance driven economic crisis, which isn't just to do with COVID, but is to do with the fact that finance and profit are being put first. And, you know, we can see that also in the management of COVID. But when the 70s too, there was a crisis. And again, it was a financial crisis. And I just want to quote Mike Cooley, who sadly died last year, but he was one of the, along with Brian and John and Phil Asquith and others, he was one of the leading thinkers and actors behind this. He was a design engineer, like Brian, but he was from North London. Brian's from Birmingham. And he said, there is talk of crisis wherever you turn. But I think we have to stand back from that crisis for a few moments and see where we are in relation to it. For it is the present economy, the finance-driven economy, that has a crisis. We don't. We're just as skilled as we were. Miners can still dig coal, bricklayers build houses, and we can still design and produce things. So there's that sort of sense that the crisis is a crisis of an economic system that we don't have to reproduce, we don't have to be part of. And so that leads me on very briefly to say the importance now of the Lucas experience is that it provides not a model to be imitated, but tools for exactly that process of thinking about and practicing and campaigning for an alternative. So the 5 tools that I can think of, I'm sure John and Brian can add, but firstly, or they're not tools, they're principles. Firstly is the idea that there are alternatives, that technology does not determine one way, that throughout the technological design process, and I'm not a designer, so I'm speaking from listening to the Combine, and to do this book, I sat in on all their meetings and they let me interview them ad nauseum, and well, ad nauseum for them probably, it was wonderful for me. But so listening to them, you knew that the design process is about choices. And even in their training, they're trained to work on all kinds of different alternatives for the technology that they can master. So alternatives are built into the design process, and it's not a simple idea of linear, onwards and upwards sort of technology. Technology is a political and moral and ethical matter. The second key principle is that the knowledge in the design process lies with the workers, that they have that knowledge, that the Combine stress the way in which tacit knowledge is a kind of knowledge that's not fully acknowledged in sort of political circles. I mean, by tacit, that's knowledge. Sometimes we cannot say exactly what we're doing, but we can do it. So, whether it's crossing the road or, when you're a child, you're maybe, I don't know, making an airfix kit or something, and your parents say, "What are you doing?" And you say, "Oh, get away, I know what I'm doing," and you do it. And that tacit knowledge is in design, so, and in the production process, in the skilled engineering. And so what was important about the plan was actually doing prototypes, not just writing documents. And that knowledge, I think, is crucial to any understanding of a new strategy for industrial progress. That, in Nottingham, you've got masses of workers who are working in either small companies or in the public sector, but whose knowledge is a huge resource. And often the public sector doesn't fully acknowledge, policymakers don't acknowledge that as a resource because it's not available in documents and so on. But it's hugely to be valued and should be the basis of any new thinking of policy. Then there's the point which Tony Benn outlined, which is anticipating the problem. So developing a sort of investigative dimension to what you're doing, sort of seeing where the companies are that are vulnerable, and thinking about alternatives with those workers, planning in advance, a kind of planning from below, planning that came up from the bottom, as the film says. A fourth principle is the linking with communities. So the idea of production for need, as distinct from for profit, is based on a recognition that social need exists all around you. I mean, disabled people, medical need, even in your own community, let alone I mean, the Lucas Plan also looked at international needs for transport in developing countries. Ecological need, obviously, now is more and more important. The kind of ecological alternatives involved in renewable energies, that's an area of need. And linked to need, social need, is public procurement, because, you know, government buying is not, or shouldn't be at any rate, about the market. It's about the needs of the people. And so linked into alternative forms of production is a different kind of procurement strategy. And that obviously applies to local government, which is what is your sort of political lever. And then finally, another lever locally is the unlocking of the resources and capacities of educational institutions. So universities, you know, higher education, technical colleges, all have, you know, immense capacity. I mean, I worked for the Greater London Council, and we, with Mike Cooley, who also worked there, we unlocked the resources of the universities of London and made them part of a strategy for alternative technologies. And I'm sure a part of your thinking is, and if not, really probably ought to be, if I can suggest, you know, linking up with the key departments in the university to see how far those resources could be made more publicly used. I mean, they're publicly funded, so they should be a resource for the community. So those are, I'll stop there. That gives you the historical context and some of the key principles, which the film will portray and explain and show in a very vivid sort of way. There's no romances and there's no murders, but it is a very good film.
Okay, thanks, Hilary. We'll move on to the film, and we'll see Hilary later after the discussion. Hopefully this will work.
Hello, everybody. I'm a little bit late. Sorry for that.
When you're looking for a job, you're looking for a job. You don't make choices. Some people do. Some very principled people make a decision not to work in the arms industry, but you go to a company because you're going to get paid and you're going to feed your wife and kids and whatever. But then when you get settled in, you get more confident. You then doubt to say, well, why am I doing this?
This is a story about when these workers' livelihoods were threatened, and they came up with an alternative plan.
They expressed their great anxiety about the future of their company and the prospects for employment. And I said to them, well, look, why don't you go away and do a corporate strategy of your own company based on your own knowledge of the company, of the equipment, of the skills, of the market available? And they did. And it's one of the most remarkable exercises that's ever occurred in British industrial history.
We took the view that it was no good just waiting until the problems were on us and then whining to the government or to the TUC or whoever that we want the right to work. We thought that we have a very highly skilled, very competent workforce, and we have the intelligence amongst ourselves to devise or endeavour to solve the problems for ourselves.
Because it's a very small step to go from power generators and aircraft to wind turbines.
A plan that's even more pertinent today.
And you'll see things in there, cheap, efficient heating systems, propulsion units, such as hybrid engines for motor vehicles, that uses the best characteristics of both the petrol and electric engines. Power generating equipment. Lucas Aerospace, a core business almost, was power generation gas turbines to provide the electricity for aircraft. So in the plan, there's a proposal for wind turbines. an example of a product that came up from, actually it wasn't one of our members, it wasn't a union member in our office. He said, I'm against more or less everything that you do, Phil. He said, but I really support this. He'd worked on heat pumps and that kind of technology for a long time, and we actually developed a prototype heat pump powered by natural gas.
What the corporate plan was saying, you make socially useful product, and when we look at cutting back on defence, what could you do with the skills that you've got, with the capital that you've got? What could you make if you weren't making that?
That had been spent on mass transit, heating system, solar power, wind generation, all of those sectors would provide more jobs.
And it all happened 40 years ago. 150 alternative products developed from the shop floor for a more sustainable world.
These ideas are around, it's just a question of bringing them together, of developing them into something that will really work. We had 4 or 5 of the most technically minded people actually sorting out, will this work, will it not? People who actually design parts for aircraft that keeps aircraft in the air. So they weren't airy-fairy, I mean, they knew what they were doing. But it tapped into the workforce, and if you've got people who had ideas, they wanted their ideas to be known as well.
And that was when the whole notion of the political climate we were in was writ larger, because the government were the main customer of Lucas Aerospace, but somehow there was a political definition of profit at work. That it was profitable to make arms, paid for by taxpayers' money, but not profitable to make life-saving equipment, paid for by taxpayers' money. So there's a pure political definition of profit taking place there. I think what I saw, along with my colleagues around me, was the world around us was not right. The technology was not being used in the interests of ordinary working people. The control of technology and where the money is put into scientific research. It's okay to pour tens of millions of pounds, if not billions, into researching and developing and improving, say, a fighter's maneuverability by 2%. That's okay. And that always used to be done on a cost plus contract. So the company could charge what they want. But, it's not profitable to keep an extra 3,000 people a year alive for want of kidney machines. 3,000 people who are dying each year for want of a kidney dialysis machine.
And Lucas already made this particular product, but they were reducing the numbers they were making. And there was, at the same time, there was more of a need. You're a worker as well as being part of the community. I mean, that's the two things. You can't just see yourself as a worker. Okay, you're going there to get yourself a living, but also you're taking into account you live in a wider society. Your neighbour's probably got a problem with the kidneys or whatever. So there's a connection there, and you see the various things that are going on. You see about the environment, about the fact that we're running out of oil, and it was we had to look at other forms of motivating cars. So you just haven't got this sort of set mind of a worker, but you also, once you get to a position where you're saying, well, we haven't got enough, they say we haven't got enough work doing this, they wasn't getting the aerospace work, then I think automatically, if you're going to talk about other products, you're going to talk about something useful, because you're a person, you're a human, you're affected by it all.
And whilst we were looking at the corporate plan in terms of preserving our jobs, we were looking at society in a broader sense. We wanted to broaden it out. And in many respects, it broadened itself out. It took us on paths. Energy, the main areas in energy was conservation of energy and the storage of energy, particularly in housing. They developed designs in building houses that were energy efficient, run in conjunction with the ideas that we have about developing systems with local authorities to support people with design input in building their own houses and building in these energy conservation systems. Then ordinary people who were unemployed could then be put to work building their own house, and it would be designed in such a way as to be energy efficient, both in terms of conserving the energy in the house and maintaining and collecting energy that would be for their use and their community's use.
Light them all up. Come on, fire. Right.
We're in a period where oil prices have quadrupled. It was just after yet another conflict in the Middle East. So again, the political backdrop to the construction of the plan meant you couldn't actually do anything without thinking of the energy consequences of it. So the conservation of energy in the production process, and then that whole notion of built-in obsolescence, which was a wastage of energy, and Lucas Motors were a past master of that because they were designing motor car components for obsolescence. Design meeting at Great King Street that Mike used to talk about, where the secondary market for spare windscreen wiper motors was flagging because they were lasting too long. So they reduced the bearing area by 30%, so the windscreen wiper motors would wear out quicker, so they'd sell more on the spares market. And the cost to the planet in raw materials of that built-in obsolescence type manufacture, which is still with us, isn't it? That things don't last, so they end up on the tip. So you have to mine more scarce materials, you have to fight and wage war over who controls the raw materials. And there was the proposal to try and stop design for built-in obsolescence, and therefore things should be made in a fashion where they could be repaired, and the skills then for repairing cars, washing machines, dishwashers could be taught to perhaps younger people as a means of giving them a skill set, the awareness of energy and repair rather than design for built-in obsolescence.
Young people searching for spare parts on this waste dumping Ghana wasn't exactly what Phil had in mind. All this no doubt a profitable way to meet EU recycling targets. One of the largest poisonous waste dumps for thrown away Western goods. Small change to what can be made on the grander world dumping grounds.
In the division where I worked, the engine management division, Lucas, they wanted just to concentrate on aerospace products and didn't really get involved in industrial applications of gas turbines. And some of these gas turbines, I think it was the GG220, was particularly suitable for combined heat and power systems within communities, so that you could have the system, you know, again under the head of energy conservation, using a gas turbine generator. It would provide heat and power for a local community.
Is it a town, is it a city, or is it just an housing estate? You determine the community, then you look at the size of the power plant that you need to do that. The gas turbine, develop the gas turbines, they will give you power, that's your electricity, they will give you your heating, and it will be all in one system. And all you need is the switching gear in each house to control the input into the house from that source. And then you can feed it off to the grid, what's left of it, but it's a community thing. The community have to be involved, they have to discuss it, they have to know what's going on, know how to work it, and know how to control it. I mean, you've got to remember that all the systems of sewerage, etc., all goes back to local authorities. I mean, it's not big business that starts these, it's local authorities. Like towns like Birmingham in the 19th century. So we're going back to that in a sense. It's, dare I use the phrase, back to the future sort of thing, that people controlling their own environments, controlling their own energy inputs and outputs, and paying for it, which they do, whether it's big business running it or they're running it for their own use. But the profits, if there are any, are for the community. They're not for whoever, some French owned outfit that owns the power supply system. It's democratizing power supply, if you want.
I mean, I don't think it's just a question of deprivatizing the companies. I think they've got to go one step further than that, not just back to the old electricity boards, but to do something back in the communities where it all started from in the first place.
I mean, you think about the involvement of the community, setting up those systems, which diminishes the influence of the multinational power companies, and it makes them independent of them. So they all have to be involved in the decisions. They all have to be involved in how the system works. They're creating jobs in their own particular economy. And as a consequence of that, this is only one example of how civil society is being used for its own ends. And in the end of the day, I suppose, for its own profit in that sense, if you want to use that term. So it's not just the power supply itself, it's the effect it has on society. I mean, you're taking on the big builders and all the rest of it. I mean, you come up with an idea where 1 million unemployed people can start building houses which are energy efficient and save on the costs. I mean, the building industry is not going to look at that with great, you know, they're not going to have great enthusiasm for it. You'd need the government support, finance, local authority support, finance, but the big builders get that anyway. They get government support, they get local authority support, and the housing prices go through the roof. And working people can't afford them. We're saying protect society and develop society in a fair and equitable way. I mean, the system tries to say that that's you, that's them, nothing to do with one another. But we are a society, and if we're going to look at work, and we want to look at energy, and we want to look at efficiency, then we have to look at society as a whole. And that's what we're about. That's what Lucas Aerospace was about. Not Lucas Aerospace, but Lucas Aerospace Joint Shop Stewards were about.
After we'd presented it to Lucas Aerospace directors, they refused to meet us ever again, rejecting the whole thing lock, stock and barrel, including hybrid power pack technology for cars and including wind turbines. The term that management used to discredit that particular proposal for wind turbines was, it's in the realm of the brown bread and sandals brigade, and we're aerospace.
In the electronics department, every time we met the management, they made it clear that they weren't interested in any alternatives. They were just upgrading the electronics on the aircraft side, and they saw that as the future, and they didn't want to know about anything else.
After the management rejected the corporate plan, the Combine felt it was necessary to demonstrate that 2 or 3 of the products that we could afford to build from our meagre Combine and supporter resources could actually be translated into products, socially useful products, that would have technical feasibility. So with the assistance of the North East London Polytechnic, funding was obtained from, I think it was Roundtrees, which helped develop a hybrid power pack for a Hillman motor car. And so they basically transplanted an electric drive system onto a Hillman and a control system to demonstrate the viability of a hybrid drive.
Then I heard that Cadbury Trust could make £60,000 available if we could set up a centre in the Midland area. I had that discussion with the University of Warwick. They went to the Senate to discuss the idea of us having a unit there, the business school there, but they got very clear links with Lucas, and obviously they were frightened off. £60,000 worth of money was, you know, it had won something for 3 years in those days. It was a good thing. There were people there who wanted to respond to those sorts of initiatives and welcomed it. But the bureaucracy or the management were very hesitant. It was interesting to see what you were dealing with and how they resisted it. And in the end, we got this agreement with the Polytechnic in Coventry. And that set up the unit for development of alternative products.
And quite early on in the project, there was an electric car that was running around, well, an electric vehicle, a small truck actually, that was running around in Coventry, you know, in the early 70s.
And then the Open University, along with ourselves, had a chat, and we got a project going, and we actually developed a prototype gas-powered heat pump powered by natural gas. Hitherto, they've been powered by electricity, which wasn't the most thermal efficient way of doing it. And we actually built, they actually built a gas-powered heat pump. And Sheffield City Council became very interested in gas-powered heat pumps. And that interaction partly led to the inclusion of the concept of social use production in the Labour group's manifesto.
The latest government report suggests that this is one of the major means of conserving energy. The company is still saying that that is not a viable product, but we have intercepted one of the company's own market surveys, which shows that the market for these in the domestic sector by 1985 will be 255 million. So nobody can seriously suggest that that's not viable.
Can a multinational solve the problem of where we're going with the environment? They don't even ask the question. They don't say, where's our products and our systems taking the environment? It's just, will this make us a profit? And if it will make a profit, then it's made. If we can't get the toxic emissions down, let's tell lies about it. I don't think Volkswagen are on their own there. I mean, this is part of the pressure that comes on to management. It happens in most industries. But you look at what's happening in the third world, I mean, it's really horrendous. And the only way it's going to happen is by new ways of approaching society and the way involving society in the way things happen, as we've said in the products that we've mentioned.
It was a group of shop stewards really advancing the argument for sustainability in the 70s, and management dismissing it, and the cost to the planet shows the lack of responsibility the management displayed.
I think by its very nature, they couldn't solve the problem, even if they wanted to, even if they decided, you know, tomorrow I want to make the world a better place, because they would find that they would lose their competitive edge against other companies and other countries, and therefore you know, they're trapped almost in having to do what their shareholders, if you like, are demanding of them, because they are as vulnerable as anybody else in the capitalist system. So it wasn't about the individuals, it was about the system which operates in that particular way. Isn't a brave new world now?
If we don't move now, and move very, very quickly, both large and small companies alike, I think we run a major risk of losing competitiveness.
We still have time to stay in this race if we run very hard now.
It was a philosophical view of the world, and the mentality of there's only one way. And all we were doing at Lucas Aerospace was saying there are alternatives to what you're being told. All you've got to do is open your eyes and look at them. That can't be legislated for hook, line and sinker. Legislation can only be put in place that supports society, where at the moment legislation supports big business, supports the city, supports banks. The fact is they spend billions and billions and billions, does state governments, which they pour into private companies. That's okay. Right? But you want to put a few 100,000 or a few million into social useful product. No, that's the market. I think we were very challenging to the system, workers telling them what they should be making. And if you think you can do that with the entrenched power structures you're up against, we are not naive. What we wanted to do was say, well, we'll go past management right down to the shop floor and then it'll come up. Obviously, you know, you're turning the world on its head. It's absolutely turning the world on its head.
Okay, thank you. Right, can I hand over to Brian? Is John here as well? I know Brian's here. If you want to carry on that discussion that you start in that film.
Yeah, can I just give a bit of background first? I mean, Lucas Aerospace was a part of the Lucas Industries Group, which mainly dealt with the automobile side, with electrical work, batteries and braking systems. And Lucas Aerospace was a part of that particular group. Lucas Industries grew to about 90,000 people in the mid-90s. But it originated from a man named Joseph Lucas, who started the business by selling paraffin off a handcart in Birmingham. And he was an unemployed man with 6 children, and his business grew from that. And I think it's an indication that he was a bit smarter than the people 100 years later, because he diversified. You could see the way the things were going, and people were using bikes and whatever, and he invented the bicycle lamp. And his slogan for Lucas came from that, which was King of the Road. Moving on into 1960s, after that, Lucas Aerospace came about as a consequence of an amalgamation of a number of smaller companies, aerospace component companies, and Lucas were assisted by the government in bringing all those companies together. It was situated over 17 sites, and on those 17 sites, they were well organised in a trade union sense, by 12 different unions. And it soon became apparent to some of the stewards that although they were well organised on site, they needed to be organised overall the company. And they formed a combined shop stewards committee. I'm telling you all this because it's important that there wouldn't have been a plan without the combine. And the combine, which started very, very slowly in 1968, and it took till 1974 till it came to full strength. it involved all the works and staff unions, and it was a necessary addition to the existing structures, because we could only take the company on a corporate basis by having that sort of organisation. It didn't replace existing structures. We made sure of that, didn't sort of cut across union boundaries. It was a recommending body. There was one vote per site, and all the sites therefore had autonomy. So we wasn't taking the autonomy away from individual sites. As I say, it took a long time for the combine to develop. It had difficulties. You've got to understand, when you're sitting down stewards from the shop floor and the staff areas, and then the supervisors off the shop floor, time and study people who worked from the technical areas, on a day-to-day basis, they might clash, but you had to try and get over that and show they had a common purpose in dealing with the issues that the company was throwing at us, such as the rationalisation of the workforce, and that was pretty obvious from the start that they were going to do that. I'll just go through the sort of timetable, if you like, of the way the combine developed. 1971, there was a problem with Rolls-Royce, and in the end, even the Conservative government had to nationalise them because there was a danger in the company collapsing, and the effect it would have on the defence industry. And the company took advantage of the problems Rolls-Royce were having. In Birmingham, we provided the fuel components for the engines, and the big contract we got was the RB211 engine, and as a result of Rolls-Royce having the problems, Lucas brought in redundancy, and we lost 2,000 workers as a result of that. And as a consequence of that, the Birmingham sites then affiliated to the combine. They saw the importance of joining up on a national basis. In 72, Burnley were involved in a strike, a pay parity strike, and because they found out they were getting less money than the other sites, and they went out on strike, and the combine supported them with a levy, a financial levy. And as a result of that, the Burnley workers won their claim, and consequently joined the combine. They saw it as something which provided security for them all. And it was about 1974 then the combine became full strength. And just the combine organisation was self-funded. It was funded by the members. We just had a levy, an annual levy, very small amounts of money just to keep the combine going. It produced the combine news so that we was able to communicate with the workforce. It had a pensions advisory committee, which improved the pensions on Lucas Industries as a whole. And it had a science and new technology committee, so that if any of the sites wanted to know about any sort of equipment that was going to be taken into on their site, they only had to phone up and find out what that meant. And then in 1974, we cast our minds back. There was a Labour government elected. It had a very radical programme. Ben was the Secretary of State for Industry. We approached Ben on the basis that we wanted to be nationalised. We felt we'd be more secure being nationalised than rather remaining in a private company. And as a result of that meeting with Ben, he said we weren't going to be nationalised. It was only going to be the aerospace industry, not the component part of the aerospace industry. And he sent us away then to put forward the alternative strategy. And you've seen details of that in the film. And I just wanted the plan. I just wanted to go through the different elements of the plan, really, and now not only did they apply then, but they very much apply now. One of the elements is industrial democracy. I mean, you could sort of example of industrial democracy and what we did, in as much that we got the workforce to the work with all this. Before they got a tin pot suggestion scheme where they paid you to way to produce it. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, you keep.
Can you hear me?
We're freezing a bit, but I think you're all right now.
Okay. No, carry on.
Yeah, carry on.
I'll say industrial democracy. That was their first taste, if you like, of industrial democracy within the company, because they had the opportunity to make a contribution to the company's direction or the products they made. I mean, interestingly, at that particular time, big discussion going on about industrial democracy. There was the Bullock report that was produced, and there was some quite sound suggestions made, but because of the political situation changing with Thatcher coming in, that never came to pass. Interestingly enough, that in Europe and Germany in particular, they have what they call co-determination. In Germany, that's been going since the end of the Second World War. So that's one particular issue in industrial democracy, and I think that's something that should be discussed now within the labour movement, how workers would benefit from that. I talked about product development, how the workers were involved in that, and as was pointed out in the film, not only when, as I said at the outset, that when you go to your wife and kids and you pay your bills and whatever, you don't think too much. As time went on, and as we get involved in producing the plan, you not only become a producer, you're also a consumer. You've got another look, another view on it. So that was another area that was identified within the plan. Also, de-skilling, the waste that workers themselves, with the introduction of new technology, were being de-skilled and you know, were acting real almost like robots rather than people, and those were the sort of issues that we talked about. Also, again, the waste of resources, built-in obsolescence. You know, it was questioning the sort of ethos of the capitalist system in a way in doing that. And also the international connections that we made, where I was invited to Sweden twice, Germany once, and America I went to as well, you know, and we was able to get the message out over there. And, you know, it's still being talked about over there at this particular time. And another issue that was raised within the plan, like as when we developed the plan, was the government private sector. In Lucas during the 70s, Lucas Industries had a profit of £251 million, and excuse me, but the only tax they paid, or the only money that went to the exchequer after the taking away the grants, the development grants, and deferred taxes and whatever, was less than £500,000, £470,000. So at £251 profit, there was just £470,000 paid in tax. Now, I mean, if the workforce had been growing and the company developing as a consequence of that, you probably couldn't have an argument. But during that particular time, the workforce of Lucas Aerospace reduced from 18,000 to 12,000. So you can, that is another issue, and I think that's an issue that really needs to be taken up. There's an interesting website that people could look at called Corporate Welfare Watch, where the people from Nottingham University are examining the amounts of money which goes into private industry. Nobody really knows about that. I mean, they talk about social welfare and welfare scroungers and whatever, but they never talk about the private businesses who, on the one hand, don't want to be intervened by the government. They want to get on with their own business, but are quite happy to pick up grants and whatever from the government and from us, the taxpayers. Then the next issue within the plan was the trade union academia link, when we teamed up with the North East London Poly and the Coventry Polytechnic. That was a very sort of interesting exercise and very helpful for the stewards, that you was able to approach these organisations, not only to develop the products that we were suggesting, which they did at North East London Poly, as Phil said, but also at Coventry Poly, and also to provide information to us whenever we went on some of these talks. So that was another issue. And the last issue I want to raise is the fact this alliance of the government, it was a Labour government at the time, the company and the trade union officials. There seemed to be an alliance there which didn't always work in our favour, and in the end, I think was our downfall, which is unfortunate, given that the Labour government at the time, when they were elected, they were talking about shifting the balance of power away from corporate interests to ordinary folk, and it was an ideal opportunity for them to do that when we came along with our plan. But although, and when you think the plan was suggested by a government minister or Secretary of State, I mean, he suggested that we produce the plan, but when it came down to it, although the government of the day had got the policy of shifting the balance of power, and the fact that the Labour Party itself policy was in favour of the Lucas plan, they didn't cough up, and the opportunity was lost. I'll just finish on this particular point. As it said, the company rejected the plan on the basis that we were an unofficial body. They wouldn't even meet with us to talk about the plan, let alone discuss the products. And that was because really there's a weakness in the trade union structures, in as much that although there was recognition of multi-union committees at site level under the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions, at national level there was no recognition of multi-plant, multi-site committees. So, and the company used that to good effect to prevent us making progress. And unfortunately, some of the trade unions, we've seen letters that have been provided to us, letters showing that some of the unions were more in support of the company's position than our position, on the basis that they were going to lose some of their autonomy. Or so they said. But really, as I said at the outset, we were not cutting across any of the trade union structures. We were something in addition, which was required. So that's if you like, a summary of what went on as I saw it. Now, the plan resurrected the idea of what we did all those years ago. And I mean, and I've praised Steve Sprung for the work that he did on that. Bringing it back to notice, because it really is relevant today, what we're saying. all those issues I've raised, you know, are still issues that need to be addressed. And out of the plan, there came the 2016 conference, which was the new Lucas Plan Working Group, who are developing ideas and along the same lines as what we were, and hopefully taking the baton away from us and moving on. And as a result, it brought the three of us, John Routley, Phil Asquith and myself together, having regular meetings. And out of those regular meetings, we have produced the Lucas Aero Combine Shop Stewards Committee.org website, which gives the history of what we did, suggestions about industrial democracy, my thoughts on that, and my thoughts on the amounts of money that go to industry, and also the links that we had with academia, and also pointing out the relevance today, because the website's not just about a trip down memory lane, it's relevant now. Quite recently, and I'm coming on to what Hilary was saying earlier on, quite recently, we drew up a paper which was indicating that we feel that there's an opportunity there for those who are opposing what the government are saying, or their lack of activity with regard to the climate crisis, and also the way they dealt with the current pandemic, that there should be a coming together of groups, including the trade unions and peace groups and green groups, and drawing up some alternative plan so that people can see some difference from what the government is saying. Because what the government is saying really is a concentration of spending money on so-called defence projects. Another 24 billion is going to be spent in the next 24 years. And they're pointing out the potential threat from China and Russia. Yet the potential threats, as we see it, are the climate crisis and future pandemics. And we think that should be addressed by people like-minded to us. Well, that's my contribution.
Oh, thanks very much, Brian. I want to throw it open. If people want to make comments, you can do it in the chat, or if you want to put your hand up. But first, before I throw it open like that, there's two people I want to invite for brief comments who've been invited. One is Tom Unterreiner from the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation and Spokesman Press, who were responsible, amongst other things, for quite a lot of the early literature on and from the Lucas Shop Stewards, but also recently edited work by Mike Cooley, who you saw in the film. And then I'll move to Dave King from the new Lucas. So Tom, first of all.
Thanks, Alan. I think it's been about 12 months since I last saw a version of the Plan film. I think the last one I saw was the extended version, and I think I'd half forgotten quite how exciting that whole experience was. I wasn't born, just to be clear, although I worked for the Russell Foundation and published Spokesman books. I wasn't born when the whole Lucas experience happened, and all my knowledge of it is secondhand. But the thing that I'm going to just a couple of comments on the Lucas plan and the Lucas experience before I talk about Mike. The thing that always strikes me about the Lucas aerospace experience and Brian's brilliant work and Phil Asquith's brilliant work and all of the other members of the Combine's amazing achievements is that, to my mind, this, their efforts, the plan, the way they organised, represented an insurgency, not just against management's right to manage in the Lucas plant, not just against kind of conservatism in the trade union movement at the time, despite it being, the mid-70s being a high point of trade union action. There was certainly some conservatism there, but an insurgency against the idea that workers are just there to do what they're told and are unthinking automatons, at the behest of instructions, management protocols, algorithmic approaches to working, and being dominated by the technology that they're expected to work with. Workers are something different to that, and individuals are something different to that. So the insurgency aspect and the promotion of, the capabilities of individuals and a collective of individuals to work, to think, and to do things better than any bureaucrat, any government, any manager could conceive. Which brings me back to Mike, really. I never had the privilege of meeting Mike, although I had several conversations with him on the phone, but to say that it had an impact on the way I think would be an understatement. And linking back to the Lucas experience, one of Mike's many quotable bits of writing sums it up for me. He wrote in one of the concluding chapters to his important work, Architect or Be, "I've never met an ordinary person," wrote Mike. "Everyone I meet is extraordinary." And I think that gets to the heart of the proper approach that trade unions and the left should have to individual capabilities. And it's a message that we should carry over into how we think and how we plan things. And Mike's writings on this, some of which are collected in this most recent volume. Mike did die last year. We managed to get this book out, a Mike Cooley reader, just before he passed away. And this book opens with something that Mike wrote in 1971. It was published by his union, TAS, in 1972. And it's got the unappealing title, Computer-Aided Design, Its Nature and Implications. It was published, it was a series of talks that he, and a day school that he ran with the union at Ruskin College in 1971, when he was the president of his union. But what Mike does in those lectures and that writing is issue a very early warning about the way in which technology is deforming the experience of work, the way in which the introduction of technology is diminishing, or would at that time, 50 years ago, was diminishing the autonomy and the creativity of individual workers, the way in which it was de-skilling individuals, and the way in which it posed a distinct threat to patterns of work and in the future. And he linked that analysis both to the way in which he thought technology, and particularly computerized technology, would develop in the near future, but also the way in which capitalism as a specific system by which society is organized would utilize that technology to undermine workers' collectivity. And he warned very early on, in 1971, that more and more and more workers would simply becoming an appendage to a machine of whatever type. He warned against that. And through his subsequent efforts, including the exemplary efforts that we saw that he and a huge collective of others undertook at Lucas Aerospace, challenged that idea. So, the lessons of Lucas for me are not just about the overwhelming power and inspiration of a collective endeavor, joint workers' endeavor to replan and reimagine the way that their individual industry might operate. I think it was something more than that. It was a rallying cry about how humans as a collective and human creativity as a collective entity could do things better and could rail against and challenge and develop an insurgency against the way in which capitalism itself was developing. And for that reason, despite Mike's passing, and despite the time span between him initially warning about this and the ever-present dangers we see now, I think, in the workplace, his writings and his thought is worth revisiting. Whether you're a technologist, an engineer, a teacher, for many years I was a teacher, and I increasingly became concerned that I was becoming simply an appendage to the machine, or a machine. The machine in question was data gathering system, which would tell me exactly how it thought I was doing as a teacher every time I logged in to take a register on an electronic system. Whether you're a technologist, a teacher, an engineer, whatever you're doing, wherever you are, from a call center, where your human existence is an appendage to a red, amber, green system which flashes up on the wall, which tells you when you can go to the toilet and for how long, so on and so forth. The things that Mike was warning about in terms of the way in which work and capitalism would develop, I think have come to fruition. I just want to make two final comments. I could talk for some time, and that's one of my negative aspects. The experience of Lucas, I think, as Brian has made clear, didn't end in the 1970s, and the lessons of Lucas aren't just embodied in the work that Brian, Phil, and others are doing, or the work that the Lucas Plan is doing, or in the books by Mike Cooley and Hilary and others. It stretched into the 1980s. That idea that you could plan, that you could involve communities in the way that you developed your alternatives, the idea that you could bring in academia and experts from wherever they are, didn't stop with Thatcherism. And I'm bending down now. One of the surprising things is that you could have something like this published by the Greater London Council in 1975, edited by Michael Ward, contributed to by Hilary, Mike Cooley, and others. A big, thick plan for the London economy in 1985. Lucas and the experience there is in here, ranging from the cultural industries to small businesses to social sectors to manufacturing, embedded in that industrial plan, and we don't have many of those in any meaningful sense anymore, is the spirit of Lucas. Which brings me, I live in Nottingham. I know that I think there's at least one councillor, Labour Nottingham councillor on this chat, which brings me to the question of what's happening in Nottingham now, the local economy. What does it mean when workers at the council, one of the biggest employers at the city, are being made redundant, when there's talk of modernisation and re-envisaging the council? You can, quite rightly and understandably, there's the standard pattern of industrial relations in response to that, resisting redundancies, which is vital. But where's the unions or the left on the Labour Council's alternative plan for what should happen in our city? Where's the alternative analysis of the economy of our city?
Yeah.
Where are the alternative proposals, rather than shutting the leisure centre in Radford, in the swimming pool in Radford? Where's the worked out integrated plan of how we could save that facility along with the jobs and reboost and reboot Nottingham's economy with a different vision? Because I think, the modernisation we're going to get in Nottingham as a result of central government intervention will not meet our needs, will not be socially useful in any way, shape, or form, and will not meet the demands of the classic pattern of trade union campaigns to save jobs. I think those jobs are likely to go without an insurgency and without an insurgent alternative plan. Brian said quite a lot about what I wanted to say about military spending and the environment, so I will leave it there. But I'll leave you with this last message is that, you know, Mike has gone now. Sadly, the Lucas plan is, you know, 45 or more years old, but the lessons of those experiences, the writings of Mike Cooley, and the sort of stuff that Brian is able, and others like him who went through that experience, are able to say now with such clarity and with such urgency, are vitally important for the future of the labour movement more broadly, and I believe for humanity in general. So thank you, Unite Community Nottingham and Notts, for organising this meeting. Thank you, Hilary, for your wonderful work, continuing wonderful work, and thank you, Brian and others from the Lucas Plan, for their amazing example.
Right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I also remember the first time I got hold of a copy of Mike Cooley's Architect or B. I can see Wendy's hand up. I'll ask her if anybody else wants to put their hand up. But first, Dave King, who's from the new, well, are you still from Breaking the Frame, but also the new Lucas project, and he's been involved in developing the Lucas plan for a number of years. Okay, Dave.
Okay, thanks a lot. I won't talk much about ideas because everybody who has spoken so far have said it so well that I can't outdo them really. I'll just talk a little bit practically about what our group has done. We organised in 2016 the 40th anniversary conference for the Lucas Plan, which really went extremely well, and out of that came the new Lucas Plan group, which, you know, took on the great amount of enthusiasm there was for the Lucas Plan and its ideas and its current you know, present day relevance. So we decided to take those ideas and that enthusiasm forward. We have some, the way we've decided to do that is we have a number of working groups. One is on arms conversion, defence diversification, which is actually has had quite a big impact, I think, in that field, after that field has been rather quiet for you know, for a long time in this country. So I think we've certainly made an impact there. We've of course got a working group on just transition, since that is, you know, so much the issue of the moment. Following, you know, from the work that the Lucas Aerospace workers, and particularly Mike Cooley, did around combating Taylorism and automation of their jobs and de-skilling of their jobs. We have, again, a very relevant current issue is the seemingly inevitable sort of the juggernaut of automation and AI and algorithms. And that's my main personal interest. And we have a working group on bottom-up planning, which is more about local community-based economic planning. And the way I like to think about all those four things together is kind of rather, as Tom said, that they provide a kind of holistic techno-social alternative paradigm for how to respond to the multifarious crises that you know, that industrial capitalism has brought us to at this point in history. Yeah, it's a kind of it's an overarching paradigm, I think, and obviously particularly in this moment after hopefully towards the end of the COVID pandemic, a lot of people are now thinking about, you know, ways for building back better and different ways of doing things. So I'm sensing, you know, a lot of interest in the Lucas Plan ideas. So yeah, I think I kind of can almost stop there. I was going to talk about Mike Cooley's idea of human-centered technology and, dare I use the phrase, labour-intensive working methods that you know, I think are also kind of skill intensive, really, methods, human skill intensive methods that are certainly, it seems to me, demanded by the climate crisis. Good. So yeah, I think that's it. And I put in the chat my email if anybody's interested in getting involved in the working group. And yeah, or you can take a look at our website, which is there as well. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I can see hands from Wendy and from Ian. Oh, and Paul. Wendy. I'll go through those and the hands I can see and then go back to Hilary. I don't want to run it too long. I know Hilary's got to get away. So Wendy.
Okay, thanks. Really interesting meeting, thank you. I just wanted to make a kind of a general sort of point, which is actually come out of the Lucas and plan and the discussions this evening, and point that Hilary made at the beginning about the deep understanding that workers have of the job, a deep understanding that comes out of actual practice and doing the job, which is hardly ever recognised. And I think in current times, you know, almost everybody now is working in IT. Obviously, if you're an office worker, you're working in IT. If you're a delivery worker, you're using IT. If you're, you know, a gas engineer, or, you know, almost everybody is involved in organisations and companies, whether they're private or actually public, spend fortunes on IT systems that they impose on workers that often are not as good as they should be. They're definitely not as good as they could be if they drew on the deep understanding that workers have of how this job is done and what is needed, not only in terms of the workers, but in terms of the customers. So it was just a general point about that, kind of drawing on the Lucas plan and the amazing work sort of that they did, that I feel that this is an area that trade unions and the labour movement at large could actually work on, how to, you know, include the expertise, the deep understanding, the knowledge, the coming out of the practice of workers, which could not only improve the lives of workers, but actually improve the efficiency of companies and organisations. So that's the point. Thanks.
Yes, thanks. Ian.
Right. Well, thanks for the you know, opportunity to see the film again, which I saw last night actually, with New Lucas Plan and the COP26 groups, and there was a fantastic response there too. I'd like to make a plug for my Unite branch, EMNG58, because we managed to put some money into the launch of the film about 3.5 years ago. I remember meeting Lawrence at the trip to Jerusalem, and he gave me the check the day before and promised me, well, I had to promise to make sure I got on the train and don't mess it up. Sadly, Lawrence passed away, but from then on, our branch has been suspended and unable to participate in the activities in the city of Nottingham, which is a shame because we've got 1,400 members and we've got another 1,200 to come apparently. So it would be nice to be able to work as a union, you know, cooperatively and collectively. And I think that's a useful point. And of course, in memory of Colin Randall, in the mid-90s, we in Kate's, as our swan song, looked to explore what the internet might mean in terms of what Wendy's described in advance rather than in retrospect. And sadly, Colin is no longer with us at all, like Lawrence, perhaps it's association with me, but Colin disappeared at the start of the project in very strange circumstances, and we were scuppered So nobody was interested in looking at the impacts of technology in the mid-90s and the start of New Labour. We were actively scuppered, and you know, perhaps it was a waste of time. You know, the internet wasn't going to make any changes, was it? But it's a shame that the attitudes then, and I think of academics particularly, were that they just didn't want to know. They'd sooner exploit the technology, and you know, isn't it wonderful? And as Tom said, in 1971, maybe it's not so wonderful. Maybe we should have listened to the Lucas workers a little bit more intently then. So, I mean, that's it. But thanks again.
Right, thanks, Ian. I saw Paul waving his hand. That's all. So Paul, and then I'll get back to any final comments from Brian and from Hilary. Paul.
Yeah, I'm new to the film, but not to the concept. I was part of this Lucas experience, as he said, because as I saw in the film, a lot of it was devoted to the American military actually going around attacking foreign peoples and countries on behalf of the American government, which was being controlled by the corporate America and basically the corporate West, you know, including the friendly countries, I suppose. And I was in that military, and the reason I left it is because, as the plan was suggesting, that we had become an enforcement branch of corporate America. And I was not comfortable, you know, taking orders and paychecks from such an organization or being in any way part of it. And thus I left it. But I mean, I get a lot of that from the film about Lucas and its involvement with the Western military powers and how they still go around attacking, you know, Middle Eastern and other countries which corporate America does not agree with. And the plan itself, I mean, was hinted at here and there in the film, but there was no, you know, actual coming out of explanations of what the plan actually was. And so, I mean, I'm sure the rest of you, I mean, you could fill in the blanks, you know, as I was doing, you know, I was assuming this and, you know, could understand, you know, through context what they were getting at. And I certainly supported these ideas before and after. And so, yeah, the plan, as I understand it, you know, is putting people first in the labor market, and, you know, using these technologies to build a more socially responsible and social serving society. And that's pretty much what I got out of it.
Okay.
I hope I'm right in this regard.
Thanks, Paul.
That's pretty much it.
I can't see any more hands. Just in terms of what Tom and Wendy said, I mean, I started off my career teaching trade union courses in part, and part of that, people sat down and started talking about how they would run things better. And certainly you got plenty of good ideas about, you know, how things could be run very differently. You even get you get that in the pub sometimes as well if you started talking to people. It's a very different tradition to even the way that adult and continuing education now runs. Okay, I can't see any other hands up. Can I ask Brian? Can I see Brian? Yes.
I'm gonna
Ask
do
Brian
it.
if you've got any final comments, and then I'll move to Hilary. Brian?
Yes, I mean, at the end of the day, we were not successful. Not because lack of effort from our part. I think it was just that the system was against us. One thing that came out of it, as far as I could see, was the fact that by posing an alternative to what the management's saying, it put the management on the back foot. They were worried about, and we've seen the letters, someone from the personnel department of Lucas Aerospace sent us the letters, which was going between the different members of the management in response to what we were doing. And it was very obvious that they were on the back foot. And therefore, it is important for workers and people in the community to put things down on paper, if you like, join up together and put forward an alternative. And it's interesting that the amount of support we did get from quarters we didn't expect to get it from, because what we were saying was sensible. And I think if just by leaving it to the government and political parties, I think it's the wrong thing. And really, if change is going to happen, and history shows that it does come from the bottom up. So that's my comment. That's rather than wait for them to determine what we should do, we should start to indicate very clearly what should be done for the community as a whole.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. Hilary.
Okay, well, I'll be very brief, and it's really building on what Brian and also Tom and others have said. I mean, I think, you know, what I learned from the Combine Committee, and in a way, at the same time, I was involved in the women's movement, and what I learned from both of them in terms of my own political formation is that, you know, we either reproduce society as it is, or we transform it. You know, that we are actors, and that unless we say no, we are culpable, we are complicit in the continuing oppression, exploitation, subordination that is our society as it is. So as a feminist, I realized that unless I personally changed my relationship to men and to fellow women or sister women, you know, I'd be complicit in the continuing oppression of women. So in a way, we have to act now. We can't just leave it to government, as Brian says. We can't just leave it to delegate it to politicians. We in our own lives, and I think this is what the young students are all saying. You know, look, we've got to change our own lives now. The whole climate crisis is a result. I mean, it's a result of the power structure, but we are complicit in the power structure, and I think that's what applies to the situation now. And so I'll just quote Mike Cooley's always an inspiration and sums up what was inspiring about the Combine. I mean, so he makes it this point in terms of science, but I think it's much more general. So he says when he was accepting the Alternative Peace Prize that the Lucas Combine won, he said, the last point I want to make, and I can't, you know, he had a beautiful Irish accent, and I'm from Yorkshire and can't really imitate that. Anyway, the last point I want to make is that science and technology is not given. It's not like the sun or the moon or the stars. It's made by people like us. If it's not doing for us what we want, we have a right and a responsibility to change it. Increasingly, we've been conditioned to believe that we should change ourselves to suit technology, and it's been done in all sorts of subtle ways. There's this very famous advert, he says, in Britain, showing a woman suffering from what technology has done to her. She's suffering from quotes high-rise blues. I mean, she's in a tower block. And the advert says very subtly that she cannot change her environment. And I would ask why not. But it goes on to say that you can change your mood with tranquilizers. It's not pills and tranquilizers we need, he ends up, but a clear view of what we want from science and technology, and the courage to stand up and do something about it. And I think that's he's talking about science and technology, but I think the same applies to institutions, political institutions like the council. I mean, I worked for the GLC, and it was quite an imposing body, you know, quite sort of alarming in a way. But with Mike Cooley's inspiration, we knew that we could change it. It all depended on us either being obedient officers or saying, hang on a minute, does it have to be like this? Isn't there an alternative? And I think that's what is surely the issue in Nottingham. That, I don't know, I mean, if I was in Nottingham, I'd be thinking, well, could we in Nottingham as councillors, as trade unionists, as small socially oriented businesses, as tenants groups, as intellectuals, form the equivalent of a combine, a sort of local combine, a local coalition? And then almost a bit like the combine, it did a kind of audit almost of what its capacities were. So as Mick Cooney, another trade unionist who still works together with Brian and Phil, he said that the thing about the combine is that they ended up thinking about how to plan, you know, that the combine wanted to know what machine tools we had to do the corporate plan. We were having to think as if we were planning. It really made the shop stewards sit up. Now, surely that's what could be done in a place like Nottingham, that in a way you could do a sort of plan from below, doing an audit of all the capacities that exist, the university capacities, the knowledge of different groups of workers, the kind of public resources of public bodies like the council, the university, other public bodies. And then, as Brian says, actually develop a sort of alternative through discussion, and then turn that into proposals and demands. I mean, Brian and the paper that he and Phil and Mick have done, or John have done, is really ambitious and is saying we need a national equivalent, but let's start it locally. Let's start it where we are. I mean, I'm in Hackney, and it's sort of thing that I'd be thinking about here, but you've got more resources, more experience, you know, learning lessons, critical lessons from the Robin Hood energy, and just looking at your own capacities. So really, I'm just trying to say, you know, it's up to you, and there's a lot of support from all of us that have been involved in Lucas. But I do hope that something will come out of this meeting and future meetings in Nottingham. I mean, future action, and that you've got the Spokesman Books people like Tom on your doorstep, and they were, through the Institute of Workers' Control, they were a crucial support for Lucas. So you've got a lot of support. Now the thing is to act and change things. So anyway, thanks very much for the experience of being with you.
Thanks, Hilary. Yeah, that's a spark for action. I've just found my very battered copy of your book. I can see Phil's hand up. I don't know if that's for the right to reply or to round off.
Not
Phil?
really off. It's a quick point with me council hat on. I was elected in May 2019. We were doing some budget discussions in October, and I was desperate to get Hilary up to start doing some of this stuff with that Labour group. And I think this is what, obviously COVID has got in the way of some of that stuff, because not long after that, you know, we weren't meeting regularly and it was all Zooms, and, you know, things became more difficult. But I'd love to return to that stuff. When on the chat, I put experts and can we get other people in who know about this stuff? Well, we've heard tonight all these people talking about what can happen if you get a combine, as Hilary said, together, and we start to look at some of these issues in a local sense. So it was just that, really. I think it was really positive, and how we move that on as a union, as a council, as you know, social movements is the key really. So that was all, Alan. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Phil, and thanks, Hilary. Thanks particularly Brian, also Tom and Dave for appearing, but for the interesting discussion and hopefully the action that everything sparked. Thanks again, and if there's nothing else, I will close the meeting.